Some wars never make the news. They live on highways, in back alleys, and in the silence of men who swore never to talk. The war between the Mongols and the Hells Angels was one of those wars. It ran for decades, swallowed lives, and reshaped the entire West Coast outlaw world, ending not with a handshake, but with a federal courtroom battle over the right to exist. This is the story of the darkest conflict in outlaw history and the brotherhood that refused to lose it. Born from rejection, the foundation of the Mongols, most clubs are born from choice. The Mongols were born from a door being slammed in their faces. The late 1960s in California were violent in ways that didn't always make headlines. Young Hispanic men were coming home from Vietnam, men who had survived the jungle, survived enemy fire, survived conditions that broke soldiers twice their age. They came back to a country that barely acknowledged their service and a motorcycle culture that flat out refused them entry. No welcome, no acknowledgement. Just the same quiet message they had already received from every institution that was supposed to be for everyone and somehow was always for someone else. The Hells Angels were the kings of the California biker world. They had the highways, the reputation, the bars, and the myth. Their membership carried a wall around it that wasn't written in any rulebook. It was just understood. Latino riders weren't welcome. Not in their chapters, not at their tables, not under their patch. This wasn't a policy anyone would announce publicly. It was simply enforced through silence and doors that stayed closed. 10 Vietnam veterans stood on the wrong side of that wall. They had already survived a war. They had already proven their loyalty under conditions most men would never face. They had bled for a country that sent them into combat and then told them to be grateful they came home at all. And now they were being told by a biker club that their names weren't good enough for the patch. That rejection didn't crush them. It ignited something far more dangerous. In the garages and backyards of Montebello, a working-class grid of auto shops, liquor stores, and tight neighborhoods just east of Los Angeles, those 10 men made a decision. They weren't going to beg. They weren't going to change their names or their culture or their identities to fit into someone else's version of brotherhood. They were going to build their own. They were going to construct something from scratch that would stand on its own foundation, answer to no one else's tradition, and never require them to seek approval from people who had already shown them exactly how much they were worth. They chose the name Mongols, not for chaos, not for lawlessness, but for conquest, for the idea that an empire could be built by men the world had underestimated. The Mongols of history didn't win because they had the biggest army. They won because they were disciplined, fast, adaptable, and absolutely unwilling to accept the limits other people placed on them. Those 10 veterans understood exactly what that name meant, because they had already lived it in the rice paddies and jungles of Southeast Asia, and in the neighborhoods back home that never gave them a fair chance. Their first meetings happened in cramped rooms with the windows covered and the doors locked, beer crates for chairs, military discipline for structure. They created rules, rituals, and a hierarchy built on the same chain of command they had carried into combat. Nobody wore the patch until the entire group agreed he deserved it. Nobody spoke out of turn during meetings. Nobody acted alone without authorization from the group. Every decision was collective, deliberate, and irreversible. They weren't building a gang, they were building an institution. And they were building it with the precision of men who had spent years in a military that, for all its flaws, had taught them how to construct something that held together under pressure. Other riders in Southern California noticed them quickly, not because they were loud or aggressive, but because they were the opposite. They rode in tight formations that looked more like military escorts than recreational rides. They handled themselves with a quiet confidence that made other clubs nervous. In a world where most groups established dominance through noise and spectacle, the Mongols established it through silence and discipline. They didn't perform toughness. They embodied it in a way that didn't require an audience. And that silence was already, before a single fist was thrown, a threat. Word spread through the biker communities of East LA, San Gabriel Valley, and the working-class pockets of Los Angeles that most clubs had never bothered to understand. Here was a club that took veterans, took Latinos, took men who had been told they didn't belong anywhere that mattered, and gave them something that actually fit. Brotherhood built on military precision. Loyalty forged in shared rejection. Identity carved with their own hands from the raw material of their own lives rather than borrowed from someone else's mythology. The Hells Angels saw them forming and didn't take them seriously. That was their first mistake. Because the Mongols weren't building another local crew that would fade when the money ran out or the founder got arrested, they were laying a foundation designed to outlast every obstacle the world could throw at it. And by the early 1970s, that foundation was already solid. Chapters were spreading across Southern California. New men were patching in. The club was growing not with the chaotic sprawl of desperation, but with the deliberate precision of men who understood exactly what they were building and why. New chapters didn't just form randomly, they formed in places where the Mongols already had cultural roots. Working-class communities, neighborhoods where men understood what struggle looked like up close, places where loyalty wasn't an abstract concept, but a survival mechanism. Every man who patched in went through a vetting process that was longer and harder than most outsiders realized. Prospects weren't accepted for enthusiasm. They were accepted for consistency, for discipline, for the ability to show up without being asked and stay quiet without being told. These weren't requirements invented for formality. They were requirements designed to build an organization that couldn't be broken from the inside. The club that was born from rejection was already becoming something the Hells Angels would be forced to reckon with. They just didn't know it yet. And by the time they understood what was growing in the garages and back roads of Southern California, the moment to stop it quietly had already passed. Two empires, one map, the collision course begins. Territory in the outlaw world isn't drawn on paper, it's drawn on asphalt, in the way a pack of riders slows down as it passes through someone else's city, in the way a bar goes quiet when a foreign patch walks through the door, in the way men who have never spoken a single word to each other can stand 20 feet apart at a gas pump and both understand exactly what the moment means. By the mid-1970s, the Mongols had built enough of Southern California to make the Hells Angels pay serious attention. Chapters were operating in Montebello, East LA, San Gabriel, and Pomona. Their riders were showing up at highways and fuel stops in communities the Angels had considered theirs for years. Every new chapter the Mongols opened was a quiet signal. We are here, we are not leaving, and we do not answer to you. The Angels controlled the coastlines, the major rally routes, the historic clubhouses, and decades of carefully cultivated fear. Their name alone had intimidated rival clubs into submission for longer than most of their new members had been alive. They were the dominant force on the West Coast, and everyone in the outlaw world understood the unspoken rule: you don't expand in California without the Angels' blessing. It was the kind of rule nobody wrote down because nobody needed to. It was enforced by the weight of history and the quiet certainty that violating it carried consequences nobody wanted. The Mongols never asked for that blessing. They didn't acknowledge the rule existed. That wasn't arrogance, it was clarity. From the moment those 10 veterans built the first chapter in Montebello, the club's identity was built on one foundational refusal: they would not let another organization define the limits of their existence. Not society, not the government that sent them to war, not the Hells Angels who told them they weren't the right kind of men to wear a patch. They had already lived through that story in every institutional space they had ever occupied. They were not going to live through it again. The first real tensions weren't dramatic, they were small and deliberate. A group of Angels appearing on a highway route that Mongols had been riding for months, pulling up close and holding position. A Mongol chapter meeting interrupted when Angels suddenly appeared in the parking lot, not threatening with weapons, just present, watching, counting. A bar near San Fernando where both clubs had members, and the night the stares between patches lasted longer than anyone was comfortable with. Long enough that the bartender quietly called last round an hour early just to empty the room before anything happened. These weren't accidents, they were messages. In the outlaw world, everything is a message. And every message the Angels sent carried the same translation: back off, stay in your lane, know your place. The Mongols heard those messages clearly. They kept riding. By the late 1970s, small confrontations were becoming regular occurrences. A Mongol jumped outside a bar in Riverside. A group of Angels surrounding 2 riders on a quiet desert highway and demanding they surrender their route. Bikes turned up damaged in parking lots, with no witnesses and no explanation. Clubhouses watched from slow-rolling cars in the early morning hours. The escalation was slow and calculated on both sides, neither club wanting to be the one to light the match openly, but both feeding the fire with everything they did. What made the Mongols uniquely dangerous in this slow-building conflict wasn't their numbers, not yet. It was their mentality. These were men who had already survived war, poverty, and institutional rejection. They didn't get rattled by intimidation tactics because they had faced far worse before they were 25 years old. A group of angels pulling up alongside them on a highway wasn't frightening. It was familiar. The kind of pressure that men trained in combat respond to, not with panic, but with stillness. And stillness, in the outlaw world, is more threatening than aggression. Aggression can be matched and escalated. Stillness can't. You can't outshout a man who isn't yelling. You can't intimidate a man who refuses to be moved. The angels had built their dominance on the assumption that every rival could be scared, bought, or beaten into submission. The Mongols broke that assumption just by refusing to flinch. Every time an angel expected them to back down, and they didn't, the balance of power shifted slightly. Not enough to cause a war today, enough to guarantee one tomorrow. By the early 1980s, the map of the West Coast outlaw world had two empires on it. One built on legacy, one built on discipline. One built on the long memory of being the biggest thing in the room for as long as anyone could remember. The other built on the long memory of being told it didn't belong in the room at all. Both memories were real. Both memories were motivating. And both memories were pointed in the same direction, toward a collision that no one was going to stop. Because stopping it would require one side to accept a version of itself it was never going to accept. Something was going to catch fire. The only question was when and where. When the roads turned hostile, the first real war between the Mongols and the Hells Angels, didn't begin with a single event. It built itself, piece by piece, the way all real wars do, through accumulation, through the compounding weight of every stare, every slight, every confrontation that ended without resolution but never ended without memory. In the early 1980s, the roads of Southern California turned hostile in a way that hadn't existed before. A highway standoff outside San Bernardino marked the unofficial beginning. A pack of Mongols heading north encountered a group of angels riding the same route. No words, no signals exchanged. Just two formations pulling up side by side and holding position for miles. In the outlaw world, a formation is a language. Yielding space means yielding rank. Moving your bikes out of another club's lane means acknowledging their superiority on that road, in that moment, in that territory. Neither side moved. They rode parallel, engines roaring, for mile after mile until both groups peeled off at different exits. No blood was drawn, no shots were fired, but everyone who was there understood what had just been declared. This road belongs to both of us now, and that was not acceptable to the angels. The confrontations accelerated after that night. A group of angels at a roadhouse northeast of Los Angeles surrounded two Mongols and demanded they remove their cuts, their vests, before entering. In the outlaw world, removing your cut for another club is submission. It is the equivalent of kneeling in front of men who decided your worth without knowing your name. The Mongols refused. The bar erupted. Bottles shattered, fists flew. The fight spilled into the parking lot and continued until sirens forced both sides to scatter into the night. Nobody died that night, but something did die. The pretense that these two clubs could coexist in the same territory without formal acknowledgement of what that coexistence would cost. After that bar fight, there was no going back. The silence between the two clubs was finished. What replaced it was the specific, charged quiet of two organizations that had decided the next sound between them would be settled with force. What followed was a campaign of targeted, controlled violence, operating below the radar of most law enforcement agencies and almost entirely invisible to the general public. Clubhouses vandalized at 3 in the morning by men who knew exactly where the cameras weren't. Bikes sabotaged in driveways with no witnesses and no recoverable evidence. Men who rode alone found themselves suddenly surrounded by rivals on quiet stretches of desert highway, far from any populated area. Nothing happened in daylight. Everything happened in the gaps between ordinary life in hours and locations chosen specifically because the world wasn't watching. The Mongols responded to every escalation with the same formula. They didn't retaliate alone, impulsively, or emotionally. They organized. A Mongol injured on a Tuesday became a chapter meeting. on Wednesday, became a coordinated response by the weekend, no single member making private decisions. Every move vetted, approved, and executed with the same military logic their founders carried home from Vietnam. The chain of command wasn't a formality. It was the mechanism that turned individual acts of aggression into collective strategy. That structure infuriated the Angels more than any individual act of violence could, because it meant there was no weak link to exploit. You couldn't find the impulsive member and bait him into doing something that would justify an overwhelming response. You couldn't isolate a chapter and crush it before the others knew what was happening. The Mongols operated as a single organism. Attack any part and the whole thing responds. Every Angel who tried to find the seam in the Mongols' organization found the same thing. There was no seam. By the mid-1980s, the conflict had escalated into open violence that could no longer be quietly contained. Firebombings, ambushes on highway on-ramps in the early morning hours, shootings outside bars that left blood on asphalt the owners would scrub for days without being able to fully erase. Men went to hospitals, men went to cemeteries, and through all of it, both clubs maintained the code of the outlaw world. You don't talk to police, you don't press charges, you don't cooperate with any investigation, because to do so would be to admit that another organization had the power to hurt you in ways that required outside help to address. Police task forces began quietly documenting a pattern they hadn't seen before, not random biker violence, but systematic, coordinated warfare between two organizations that had developed the organizational sophistication of rival armies. Officers began using language in their reports that they had previously reserved for organized crime syndicates. They weren't dealing with clubs, they were dealing with enterprises. The Mongols, especially, were being studied with a new kind of urgency. Detectives noted their communication discipline members who said nothing during interrogations, not because they had been coached to stay silent, but because staying silent was so deeply embedded in the culture that it was involuntary. They noted the tight riding formations, the rotation of leadership positions to prevent any single arrest from decapitating the organization, and the way chapters in different states seemed to coordinate activity without any centralized communication that investigators could intercept. This wasn't just a club at war, this was a military structure at war. The Angels had more history, more mythology, and more chapters spread across multiple countries. But in the specific theater of this conflict, the highways and streets and bars of the American West, the Mongols had something the Angels couldn't replicate. Adaptability born from the experience of building an institution with nothing. When you've never had the luxury of relying on your reputation alone, you develop the muscle of constantly evolving. The Angels fought with the confidence of an empire that had never truly been challenged. The Mongols fought with the ferocity of men who had everything to prove and no flaw beneath them if they failed. By 1987, both clubs had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The war was no longer a territorial dispute. It was personal, ideological, and generational. Men who had never met each other were fighting based on patch color alone. Men who had patched in long after the original conflict began were inheriting a war whose origins they only knew from stories told in garages. The original reasons had been buried under so many layers of accumulated grievance that no single act of diplomacy could have untangled them. Nobody was negotiating, nobody was backing down. The roads kept getting darker, and the country was about to get a front row seat to exactly how dark they could get. Blood in the Desert, the Laughlin Massacre. There are moments that define a war, not because they are the bloodiest, but because they are the most visible, because they drag something private and subterranean out into the full light of the public world and force everyone to look at what has actually been happening beneath the surface of ordinary life. For the Mongols and the Hells Angels, that moment came in Laughlin, Nevada, April 2002. The Laughlin River Run was one of the largest motorcycle rallies in the American Southwest. Tens of thousands of riders descended on a desert casino town every year for a week of riding, drinking, and outlaw culture at full volume. The strip along the Colorado River buzzed with patches from clubs across the country. Casinos that usually catered to retirees and Vegas overflow suddenly filled with men in cuts and boots. For most years, rival clubs tolerated each other with the careful neutrality of men who understood that public venues demanded at least a minimum of restraint. You might hate the man standing next to you at the bar, but you didn't start the war at a rally. This year was different. Both clubs were heavily represented. Both clubs knew the other was there. The entire rally carried the specific, charged electricity of two organizations that had been at war for years, suddenly occupying the same public space with nowhere to avoid each other. The tension was visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at, the kind of eyes-open, jaw-tight awareness that lives in the chest for days before anything actually happens. Veterans of the conflict could feel the air tightening by the second day. Then, inside Harrah's casino under fluorescent lights, surrounded by slot machines and tourists who had no idea what was about to happen, the dam broke. Witnesses described what happened next as a blur of bodies, furniture, and sound that the building couldn't contain. Fists first, then weapons that came from nowhere and everywhere, then gunshots that bounced off casino walls and sent civilians scattering toward exits in a panic. The casino floor transformed within seconds from a controlled environment into a war zone that nobody outside those walls could have imagined possible in a licensed Nevada gambling establishment. When it ended, 3 men were dead, 2 Hells Angels, 1 Mongol, dozens more were injured. Police arrested scores of riders from both clubs in the chaotic aftermath. The footage from casino security cameras was watched by federal agents, police departments, and eventually the public. Grainy, chaotic images of men in cuts moving through a casino with a deliberateness that looked nothing like a random brawl that got out of hand. It looked organized. Because it was. Laughlin changed everything about how America understood the Mongols and their war with the Angels. Before the casino footage, most of the country had only a vague awareness that outlaw motorcycle clubs existed and occasionally fought. After Laughlin, federal agencies that had been monitoring both clubs with moderate attention suddenly reclassified the situation entirely. This was not biker drama. This was an armed conflict between 2 criminal organizations operating with the discipline and reach of sophisticated enterprises. The assessment changed overnight. Congress held hearings. Law enforcement task forces were expanded and restructured. The ATF, the FBI, and local agencies across the West Coast began coordinating surveillance and intelligence sharing at a level previously reserved for terrorist organizations and international drug cartels. Politicians who had never heard the name Mongols before were suddenly briefing their constituents on the threat of outlaw motorcycle clubs. But what Laughlin revealed about the Mongols themselves was more important than any government response. In the chaos of the casino, with everything happening at once and no time to organize or respond strategically, the Mongols didn't scatter. They didn't break formation. They didn't run. They moved together with a coherence that veterans watching the footage later described as something that looked less like a bar fight and more like a combat response. Men trained to hold together under fire, holding together under fire. The Angels had expected the way powerful clubs always expect from challengers, that when the real violence arrived at maximum intensity, the Mongols would come apart. The structure that looked so disciplined in peacetime would fracture when the pressure became extreme enough. It didn't fracture, it held. And in the outlaw world, holding under fire against the Hells Angels in front of witnesses and cameras is not just survival, it is a declaration written in the most permanent ink available. After Laughlin, the war went underground, but it didn't cool. The violence became quieter, more targeted, and harder for law enforcement to track or anticipate. Both clubs adapted their tactics, moving in smaller units, changing routes and patterns, making themselves harder to surveil and harder to predict. The entire outlaw world tightened around the conflict like a fist closing around something fragile. But something had fundamentally shifted in the balance of the conflict. The Mongols had stood in the middle of the Hells Angels storm in the full view of the country and refused to fall. That moment cemented something that had been building since a Montebello garage in 1969. The outlaw world would never see the Mongols as underdogs again, and the Hells Angels would never again have the luxury of underestimating them. Operation Black Rain. The government goes to war. After Laughlin, the federal government didn't just want to arrest a few members and close the file. They wanted to decapitate an organization. They wanted to do what no rival club, no raid, no surveillance operation had ever managed to do: permanently dismantle the Mongols from the inside out. The ATF had been watching the club for years. They understood, in the way patient institutions eventually understand relentless subjects, that you could not dismantle the Mongols from the outside. The structure was too tight, the code of silence too deeply embedded, the chain of command too carefully distributed across too many chapters in too many states for a standard raid or a targeted prosecution to do more than trim the edges. Every time law enforcement hit one part of the organization, the rest sealed around the wound and kept moving. To truly break the Mongols, you had to go inside, deep inside, and you had to stay there long enough to learn the anatomy of the organization well enough to know exactly where to cut. Operation Black Rain began in the mid-2000s without fanfare or announcement. A small group of ATF undercover agents began the slow, painstaking process of infiltrating the most disciplined outlaw motorcycle club in America, not by pretending to be bikers, by becoming bikers or close enough to it that the distinction stopped mattering to the men around them. They started at the bottom, the way all prospects start, showing up reliably, keeping their mouths shut, carrying tools to runs without being asked, fixing problems before they were asked to fix them. Never trying too hard, never making themselves memorable in a way that would invite scrutiny. In an organization built on the principle that you prove yourself through consistency rather than spectacle, they proved themselves through consistency. Week after week, month after month, showing up and performing and doing nothing that would cause the men around them to look twice. Months passed, then a year, then two. The agents attended funerals. They rode hundreds of miles on club runs through desert heat and mountain passes. They sat around tables in garages at 2 in the morning where conversations never stopped and never left the room. They watched leadership dynamics unfold in real time. They learned which members held real authority versus ceremonial titles and documented the patterns of who deferred to whom and whose voice ended a debate without anyone explicitly acknowledging they had the power to end it. They were building a map, not of geography, but of power, and the map was extraordinarily detailed. The more trusted they became, the deeper they went. They started attending meetings where real decisions were made about territory, about rivals, about the ongoing war with the Angels. They heard accounts of past violence, told not as confessions, but as history, the way veterans in any organization remember defining moments. They documented everything: routes, names, alliances, rivalries, internal tensions that could be exploited, and the disciplined silence that the club used to protect itself from exactly the kind of infiltration happening around them. The irony of documenting the club's anti-infiltration culture was not lost on the agents who filed those reports. The Mongols never suspected, because the agents didn't move like cops. They moved like men who had found the place they belonged. And in the most unsettling way, that performance became something closer to reality the longer the operation ran. By 2008, Operation Black Rain had grown into the most extensive, undercover infiltration of a motorcycle club in ATF history. Dozens of agents and informants embedded across multiple states. 3 years of documentation covering the full operational scope of the club's activities. And on the morning of the 21st of October, 2008, federal teams moved across 6 states simultaneously, a coordinated strike that hit dozens of locations before the sun was fully up. Built on the same precision the Mongols themselves had always used when they wanted to send a message that couldn't be ignored. More than 160 arrests, dozens of raids, weapons, bikes, documents, and financial records seized. Clubhouses cleared out before most members understood the scale of what was happening. For the Mongols, it felt like the ground had been pulled from beneath them, a sensation made more disorienting by the realization that the people who had orchestrated it had been sitting next to them for 3 years. For the ATF, it was the payoff of the longest long game in their history. But the biggest blow wasn't the arrests, it was what the government attempted to do next. For the first time in American history, federal prosecutors attempted to seize a motorcycle club's identity itself. They wanted the legal authority to make the Mongols patch the iconic black and white Genghis Khan emblem that members had worn on their backs for nearly 4 decades illegal. Not just regulated, illegal. A criminal act simply to wear it in public. They argued that the symbol wasn't cultural expression. It was a criminal trademark whose entire function was to project violence and facilitate organized crime. They wanted the court to give them the power to strip it away. This wasn't just an attack on a club. It was an attack on the concept of the club, on the idea that a group of men could build an identity, attach that identity to a symbol, and wear that symbol without government permission. Strip away the patch, and you strip away the brotherhood, the recruitment, the recognition, the culture, and the history. You make the Mongols a name without a face, an institution without a flag, a story without a cover, and for a moment, it almost worked. The patch trial. When identity became a battlefield, the courtroom was quieter than most expected. Mongols members who attended the hearings came in suits. They sat beside their lawyers without visible emotion, without outbursts, without the kind of performance that defense attorneys spend half their time trying to prevent. No gestures toward the gallery. No statements to the press on the courthouse steps. No social media campaigns from the support network outside. Just presence quiet, composed, and completely unreadable to anyone who expected a biker club to behave like the version of a biker club they had seen in movies. These were people who had spent their entire lives being told they were not allowed to exist in spaces they occupied. Courtrooms were just the newest version of a door being slammed. They had survived every previous version. They would survive this one. The legal battle over the Mongols' patch became one of the strangest and most consequential First Amendment cases in recent memory. Prosecutors brought the patch itself into evidence, not as a symbol, but as a weapon. They showed photographs of crimes committed by members wearing it. They called the emblem a tool of intimidation that announced to anyone who saw it the presence of organized criminal violence. They argued that the government had a compelling interest in seizing a trademark that had become, in their reading of the evidence, a mechanism specifically designed for terror. Defense attorneys pushed back with arguments that resonated far outside the biker world. They argued that the patch was protected expression under the First Amendment, that it represented cultural identity, brotherhood, and belonging, the same fundamental human needs that drive any person to join any organization, that you cannot outlaw a symbol, you prosecute individuals for their acts. The patch is not the crime. The man who commits a crime is the crime, and conflating the two was not justice. It was the government trying to criminalize the act of belonging. Legal scholars who followed the case were genuinely divided in ways that had nothing to do with sympathy for outlaw motorcycle clubs. Some believed the government had a viable argument that certain symbols, demonstrably tied to criminal enterprise in documented and systematic ways, could be regulated under existing frameworks. Others found the implications terrifying, regardless of whose symbol was being targeted. If you could seize a motorcycle club's patch through a trademark claim linked to criminal behavior, what stopped the same logic from being applied to a political organization's logo, a religious community's symbol, or any emblem associated with a group the government found inconvenient? The line, once crossed, wouldn't stop at bikers. That argument carried weight in a country built on the proposition that the government's power over expression is supposed to be limited precisely because governments are not reliable judges of which expressions deserve protection. Months of testimony, expert witnesses on both sides, arguments that required jurors to simultaneously understand RICO statutes, First Amendment jurisprudence, and the internal culture of organizations that had spent decades deliberately making themselves opaque to outsiders. The men in suits at the defense table kept their composure with the same discipline that had built the organization they were defending. The verdict, when it came, was split in a way that satisfied no one completely. The jury agreed that members of the Mongols had committed crimes under RICO statutes, organized crime charges, conspiracy, violence in furtherance of criminal enterprise, real accountability for real conduct. But on the specific, extraordinary question of the patch on the government's demand for the right to seize a symbol and make it illegal to wear, the jury said no. The court refused to give the government that power. The ruling was not a celebration of outlaw culture. It was a statement about limits, about the point at which government power, even in pursuit of legitimate and important law enforcement goals, becomes something more dangerous than what it claims to be fighting. About the difference between prosecuting criminal behavior and erasing the identity of the people who engage in it. About the difference between accountability and erasure. For the Mongols, it was more than a legal victory. It was the confirmation of something they had always known, but never had the opportunity to prove in front of the entire country. They could be raided. They could be infiltrated at the deepest level. They could be prosecuted, dismantled, and dragged through federal courts with their entire history laid out as evidence against them, but they could not be erased. The patch stayed, the name stayed, the identity stayed. Everything that could be taken, personnel, money, infrastructure, privacy was taken, but the thing that could not be taken held. The government appealed. The appeals court upheld the verdict. The Mongols kept their patch, and the men who had built something from nothing in a Montebello garage because a door was slammed in their faces had now proven, in front of federal courts and the watching country, that no institution had the power to finish what that first rejection had started. The door could be slammed, the club would just build another one, and wear the patch on the back of the vest, it took them into the street. The war without end, legacy, consequence, and the shape of what remains. Wars don't end when the last shot is fired. They end, if they end at all, when the men who fought them run out of reasons to keep going. The Mongols and the Hells Angels never fully reached that point. After Laughlin, after Operation Black Rain, after the patch trial, both clubs emerged damaged in ways that showed differently on the surface. The Angels maintained their global network, their legendary status, and the decades of accumulated mythology that made their name recognizable to people who had never been within 100 miles of a clubhouse. But in the specific theater of the West Coast War, the highways and cities where this conflict was born and fought for 30 years, they had been tested by a club that was never supposed to survive, and the outcome was not what their history had led them to expect. That was a different kind of wound, not in numbers or territory, but in narrative. The story the Angels told themselves about who they were, the unchallenged dominant force of the West Coast, the organization that no rival could stand against that story, had a permanent crack in it. And cracks in foundational narratives are harder to repair than any physical damage. The Mongols were smaller after the federal raids. Leadership gaps existed. Chapters that had been built over years were hollowed out by arrests and convictions that took men off the road and into federal penitentiaries. Some members cooperated with authorities. Trust was tested in ways that every tight-knit organization fears most from within. The wounds were real, but the core identity remained intact. The structure built by veterans who understood that you rebuild after losses the same way you build in the first place, methodically, quietly, without announcement, that structure held. New men stepped into gaps, chapters recalibrated. The organization that had always operated best in the shadows returned to the shadows and adapted to the new reality of a post-Black Rain world. They didn't announce their recovery, they just recovered. The war between the two clubs reshaped the entire landscape of outlaw culture in ways that are still visible today. It forced every other club in the Western United States to pick positions, establish alliances, and navigate a conflict that had become the defining fault line in the outlaw world. Clubs that had maintained neutrality found that neutrality increasingly difficult and expensive to sustain. Territory that had been shared through informal understanding became contested ground, requiring explicit negotiation. The unspoken hierarchy that the Angels had maintained through reputation alone was permanently disrupted by the existence of a club that had refused to respect it from day one. Law enforcement was changed by the conflict in ways that extended far beyond both clubs. The tactics developed to monitor, infiltrate, and prosecute the Mongols became the template for how federal agencies approach organized crime in unconventional settings. The legal arguments made in the patch trial shaped the boundaries of First Amendment jurisprudence as it applies to organizations associated with criminal enterprise. Academic researchers cite the Mongols' Angels' War as the inflection point where outlaw motorcycle clubs transitioned, in the eyes of the state, from social nuisances to national security priorities. For the communities caught between the two empires, the small towns, the trucking routes, the desert highways, the neighborhoods and bars and gas stations of Southern California, Nevada, and Arizona, the war left a permanent imprint. Establishments that once hosted riders from both clubs learned through hard experience why that was a mistake. Landlords understood that commercial decisions about who to rent to carried implications that extended far beyond the monthly check. Entire neighborhoods developed informal geographies of avoidance based on which patches were affiliated with which blocks, which bars, which parts of the road, and the riders who lived through it, the men who were there for the highway standoffs, the casino floor, the midnight raids, The courtroom hearings carry the war in ways that no verdict or law enforcement operation can touch. The Mongol, who was a prospect during the worst years of the conflict. The undercover agent who spent 3 years living a double life so completely that coming back to his original identity felt disorienting. The defense attorney who stood in federal court and argued that identity cannot be outlawed. These are the people who know what this war actually cost. Not in statistics or case numbers, but in years of their lives they spent inside something that most people who read about it will never fully understand. The conflict between the Mongols and the Hells Angels was never really about motorcycles. It was about who gets to define themselves. Who gets to occupy space in a world that tried from the very beginning to tell certain men where they were and were not allowed to belong. The Hells Angels built an empire on exclusion. The Mongols were born because of that exclusion, and the war between them was always, underneath all the violence and territory and legal proceedings, a war about the right to exist on your own terms. Who really won? The answer hidden in the road. Who really won the Mongols' darkest war with the Hells Angels? It is the question that follows every chapter of this story. Every flashpoint on the highway, every courtroom hearing, every raid survived and rebuilt from. And it does not have a simple answer, because wars fought between organizations built on pride and identity are never really decided by a single battle or a single verdict. They are decided by who is still standing when the smoke has been in the air long enough for the air to clear. The Hells Angels are still standing. There is no version of this history where you ignore that fact or minimize it. They remain one of the most recognized outlaw motorcycle clubs on Earth. Their chapters span multiple continents. Their name carries weight that most organizations spend generations trying to build and never fully achieve. In this war, they suffered. They lost men on casino floors and desert highways. They lost face in confrontations they expected to win quickly and didn't. They were embarrassed publicly in ways that powerful organizations find difficult to absorb. But they did not collapse. They did not disappear. The Mongols are also still standing, and given everything they survived, that is the harder fact to fully absorb. They were born from rejection in a borrowed garage. They fought a 30-year war with one of the most powerful outlaw organizations in American history. They were infiltrated at the deepest level by federal agents who spent 3 years documenting their existence with the specific intention of ending it. They were taken to federal court, where their very identity was submitted as evidence against them, and their right to wear their own symbol was argued as a criminal act. And at the end of all of it, they are still here, still riding, still wearing the patch that a federal court tried and failed to take. So who won? If the measure is territorial dominance, who controls more of the map, who has more chapters, who has more leverage over the routes and cities and gathering points of the West Coast outlaw world, the answer is genuinely inconclusive. Both clubs hold ground. Both clubs have lost ground. The map doesn't belong entirely to either of them, and it probably never will. If the measure is institutional survival, who proved more durable against the forces arrayed against them, who demonstrated the capacity to absorb catastrophic damage and rebuild, the Mongols won something more significant than any single confrontation could convey. The Hells Angels had the advantage at the beginning of every chapter of this conflict. The numbers, the history, the resources, the reputation, the global network. The Mongols overcame every one of those advantages, not by matching them directly, but by building a different kind of strength. A strength rooted in discipline, in unity, in the absolute refusal to let anyone else define who they were or what they were allowed to be. If the measure is legacy, what mark did each club leave on the world beyond their own internal history? Both clubs built something that outlasted the specific years of the conflict. The Hells Angels built the myth of the American outlaw, the romantic, terrifying, larger-than-life figure of the man on the motorcycle who lives outside the rules. The Mongols built the proof that the myth didn't belong to anyone who could be locked out of it by the gatekeepers who claimed to own it first. But there is one final measure, one that cuts deeper than territory, or courts, or mythology. The measure of whether the original grievance, the one that set this entire story in motion, was ever addressed. 10 men were told in the late 1960s that they were not good enough, not the right background, not the right culture, not the right faces for the world they wanted to be part of. They responded by building their own world, one built on merit, on loyalty earned through consistency rather than birth, on military discipline, and on the radical and unfashionable idea that belonging should not be determined by the people who benefit from keeping others out. That world survived, not without cost, not without violence and loss, and years of pressure that would have ended any organization built on less solid ground. But it survived. It survived a war with the organization that had originally rejected it. It survived the largest undercover infiltration in ATF history. It survived a federal attempt to make its own identity illegal. And it kept the patch, the symbol that represents everything those 10 men decided to build instead of accepting the first rejection as final. The Hells Angels wanted to determine who was allowed to ride in California, who was allowed to wear colors, who was allowed to call themselves a brotherhood in the territory they believed they owned. For a generation, they succeeded. But the generation after that, the generation that watched the Mongols, refused to disappear through every attempt to erase them. The answer is no longer what the Angels wrote in 1969. So who won the Mongols' darkest war with the Hells Angels? The Mongols didn't win every battle. They didn't win every courtroom argument. They lost men they couldn't replace, gave up years they couldn't get back, and carried wounds that don't show on the surface but don't fully heal either. This isn't a clean victory story. It was never going to be. But they won the war that mattered most, the war over the right to define themselves, the war over the right to exist on their own terms, in their own skin, under their own patch, on roads that belonged to them as much as they belonged to anyone. The war that began not with a fight, but with a rejection, and ended to the extent that it ended not with a surrender, but with a symbol still stitched onto the back of a vest that no federal court could legally take. They won by surviving. And in a story that began with a door being slammed in the faces of men who had already survived everything else the world could throw at them, survival was always the only victory that was ever truly on the table. The patch is still on the vest, the road is still open, and the Mongols are still riding. That is the answer. If you want to understand the outlaw world, not the Hollywood version, not the mythology, but the real thing built by real men in real garages, then understand this: the Mongols are not a cautionary tale. They are not a trophy on a government wall. They are not a chapter closed by a federal raid or a courtroom verdict. They are the evidence that when you try to tell certain men who they are and who they are not allowed to be, some of those men will spend the rest of their lives proving you wrong. And the road is long enough that they just might succeed.